And yes, so Stephen Greyeyes, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And you are a reconciliation educator with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. That's with the University of Manitoba?
Yes. So we are a national center, but it was decided that we would be here at the University of Manitoba. If you're a cynic, you'll maybe say that real estate's cheap and we can deal with each coast, but also there's a lot of good research that happens in Manitoba about residential schools, so it's sort of a natural fit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So maybe we can get started if you could. And thank you again for this opportunity. But maybe we could start things off. You could tell us a little something about the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and its work. What does it do? What's its focus?
Certainly. So the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation was part of the mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that commission went across Canada. It gathered documents, it gathered survivor testimony, and it gathered testimony from anyone who had been involved with the residential school system to create a better understanding of just what had happened over that long history. And then, so once that wrapped up in 2015, then it was decided that a national center would be established at the University of Manitoba. And so we're a permanent archive and educational facility. And the reason we're here is so that the archives can remain accessible to Canadians, and that can be survivors, that can be community members, researchers, or even the general public for many of our records. And then we have a larger philosophical role, and this is Justice Sinclair, and I'm sure I'm misquoting him, but he said something along the lines of, Canadians can never say residential schools didn't happen, or more likely, and we even see this nowadays, people will say, well, residential schools happened, but they weren't really that bad. While it's true that some people had a good experience, residential schools on the whole really were that bad. We can show you the records that say as much, and we can show you where the children are buried in many cases. So it's important that our work is ongoing here. We do a lot of education, and so I'm really grateful that I get to speak to you, but I also will speak to public sector. Increasing engagement with the private sector and schools are a huge part of our work, both at the administration and teaching level, but even the individual classrooms.
Mm-hmm. Very important work. Last year, I had an opportunity to do an interview with an Indigenous trainer, Bob Joseph, and he runs corporate training programs. And it's really, a lot of it's about that kind of cross-cultural dialogue, which is very important. And he said that one of the problems is, quote, when cultures come together, they don't have the same history. You're approaching things from different perspectives. To that end, what are some of the things that non-Indigenous Canadians like me need to know about the history of Indigenous communities and residential schools, and what can non-Indigenous Canadians do, and what should they do to work towards reconciliation?
Oh, do you have all morning? No. I guess when we're talking about that different history that communities come with or cultures come with, one of the things that Canadians should understand is that Indigenous communities are highly local. Now, if you belong to a larger cultural group like the larger Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Ojibwe, Saulteaux communities, that ethno-linguistic affiliation stretches across much of central and western Canada. But that being said, the individual nations that are part of that larger ethno-linguistic community are highly local. So maybe their traditional territory would have spanned a couple of 100 kilometers, but that is where their culture is from, even if they do belong to a larger group. And then things get really interesting because we have really excellent examples in British Columbia, for instance, where one mountain valley not only contains a nation, which is its own ethnic group, but it also is its own language and maybe even its own language family. And so when you get into mountainous areas or something, then Indigenous people are even more local. And so when we're talking about Indigenous people, it's very important that you talk to people like Bob Joseph. Bob Joseph is an expert on the Indian Act, for instance, the law that governs First Nations reserves. And so you're getting that big picture, and I hope that we're contributing to that here at the center, but also in non-Indigenous Canadians need to get to know their locals. And that's one of the reasons that land acknowledgements are important, because it sort of forces you to understand that it isn't just, oh, well, Indigenous people live here, but I'm in Treaty 1 country, so I'll say the Cree and the Anishinaabe and the homeland of the original Métis Nation. So I make a very localized land acknowledgement. But there can even be some broader cultural things that help us understand the residential school system. So for instance, boarding schools are not unusual in Western civilization. And so I was doing a presentation and somebody said to me, well, yes, kids were abused in residential schools, but my grandfather went to a boarding school in the Netherlands, and he was either physically punished or physically abused, depending on the social context. And I mean, that's a terrible thing that happened to that person's grandfather, and we need to acknowledge that. But one of the things that we need to think about when we think about residential schools was, yes, of course, corporal punishment was the norm in Canada, maybe up until the 1960s. But when we're talking culturally, we have to understand that not only were these schools coercive, and First Nations children, Métis and Inuit children as well, were forced to attend, but also that in any Indigenous society I'm familiar with, the corporal punishment of children is not a cultural norm. And so it would be, obviously it isn't good if anyone is physically abused as a youth, but it is that much more jarring when we're talking about these cultural understandings. Mm-hmm. And now your question is a big question. What can individual Canadians do to work towards reconciliation was, I think, the last part of it. And I think that education is really key. A lot of what we think of as like racist thought and prejudice thought often comes from a lack of understanding. And so I think that we need, as settler Canadians and also as Indigenous Canadians, we need to approach this positively and say, okay, well, you've got these ideas. They look racist on the surface, but let's just unpack them and maybe we can have a conversation. Because most Canadians are fundamentally quite decent people, and if we have a little bit more mutual understanding, that's important. And so your reconciliation can happen at the individual level, and so that's when you go home, you take a book out of the library, or you educate yourself. You watch a YouTube video from our website, nctr.ca. We've got a YouTube channel associated with that. So that's happening at the micro level. It's a personal level. And then we get to the meso level, and that's where you and I are having this conversation. Like, we're just two people in a conversation, but it's going to be recorded and shared with maybe a bigger student body, and that's great. So we're already doing the work of reconciliation and educating each other sort of at the middle level. But here's the thing. All of your students are, they're university students, and they're so definitionally, they're successful people. Even if they don't feel like it right now, they're destined for a good life trajectory. And that's what allows people at the middle level where we are to influence that bigger picture. And so if settler Canadians care, I'm just going to pick an example. If you're watching a mob throw stones at Indigenous fishers on the East Coast and you phone your member of Parliament's office, that's really not going to make a difference. Let me assure you it won't. But I'll tell you what, if you make that phone call and you send a follow-up email just so there's a paper trail, and 250 people from your riding have sent roughly similar communications, that's how you and I are going to influence the macro level. And so we actually have to acknowledge our privilege, right? That, if you're in university and college, you're basically a member of Canada's middle class, and that gives us a privileged voice so we can push these things forward. And so I think that just educate yourselves, have those conversations, be open to learning, and act like you care. So that actually goes quite a long way.
Thank you. Yeah, so that gives you a certain amount of power to make change happen.
Yeah.
All right. So in your role as education coordinator with the NCTR, maybe we could talk just what strikes you as most significant about your work, and do you see that changing over time?
It's tough to look ahead even 5 years in a field like I'm working in, but what's most significant to me is that we're getting increasing engagement from the private sector. And a lot of times when we talk about we talk about residential schools, and we talk about reconciliation is actually a bigger picture even than residential schools. But we talk about acknowledging past harms. We talk about apologies. We talk about compensating victims, and rightly we should. If children have been abused within the care of the government, that entity owes them an apology and some compensation. But really, when we're talking about reconciliation as a societal phenomenon, then we need to involve the bigger economy. We need to involve the private sector. and because reconciliation needs to be economic as well. So when we look at a lot of the struggles that First Nations individuals, families, and communities faced, a lot of them are tied into poverty. Now we can look at the intergenerational undereducation in the residential school system. We can look at a racist workforce. We can look at intergenerational trauma, which is key to understanding this. And so we can understand all of these things that have brought these families and communities to the point where they are now. And there's often pretty bad life outcomes. People live in poverty to this day. But then, so we need to acknowledge those harms, but also we need to say, okay, well, what can we do positively about it? How can Canada look better in 25 years? And economic reconciliation, I believe, is a huge part of that. And so I think that that's something that I've seen change, even in the short time I've been in this role. I've been doing public education and corporate training for a long time, but I'm fairly new in this office. And that's something that I've seen ramp up even in the short time that I've been here. And I think that that is going to be part of a lasting and positive change in my workplace.
Okay. This question, it's particularly contentious now because of what's been happening, but it has a history. But we've seen apologies from prime ministers for the government's role in the residential school system. We had Stephen Harper in 2008, Justin Trudeau in 2017. Most recently, our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, chose to take a family holiday on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And subsequently, he offered an apology. National Chief Roseanne Archibald of the Assembly of First Nations stated that the government's, quote, words and actions have to be aligned. When we think about that, and that was the tip of the iceberg in terms of the response and reaction to what the Prime Minister did. And then many will call that, very tone deaf in the very least. What should government really be doing to be working toward reconciliation?
I think that the government has all the governments, and I'm saying that at different levels of government, yes, and also whoever's running the administration in Ottawa. Governments, plural, have all the information they need. They had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People years and years ago. They had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Recently, we've had the calls to justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so the governments, I think, maybe they don't have all the information, but they have enough to make a lot of positive changes. And so what we need to watch for is we need to watch for the big picture. And I would invite you to look back to the mid to late 1980s. And, we have Prime Minister Brian Mulroney had an administration in Ottawa of really varying popularity at different times. But if you look back on that, then you'll see that there were really positive things that happened with Indigenous rights during that time. There were also setbacks. And so I think that when we're looking at how our politicians are working on this, we need to look at results because we have the 94 calls to action. And so we need to say objectively, okay, well, what's already been accomplished, what's being worked on, what's not being worked on, and what could be fixed really easily, what could be fixed just by government fiat. And I think that we need to look at those results rather than seeing what our politicians are doing day to day. Because I think that we maybe shouldn't expect sainthood out of our politicians, but we maybe should expect results from them. And so just in my workplace, I'm really interested in going through those calls to action and saying, okay, well, these ones are for healthcare, these are for education, these are for different levels of government. How have these people been actually meeting those goals? So, whether or not you took a vacation, I agree, it might have been a bit tone deaf, but I think that we really need to focus on results, and we need to think about this in the long term, because reconciliation isn't one of those things where we get to 2025 and go, yeah, all reconciled, let's go home for the day. We need to look, in 2025, we need to say, okay, are we better than 2015? Are we way better than 2005? So regardless of the noise politically that happens on a day-to-day basis, focus on those things that the government already knows, because rest assured, they have the information.
Right. Okay. I'm just going to mention a quote from A National Crime, a book by John Malloy. And he said, quote, "In their direct attack on language and spirituality, residential schools we're a contagion of colonization. We agree that that we do live in a settler cultural, a colonial settler culture, and that this has been a monoculture in a lot of ways in terms of how governments in Canada have looked at this particular issue. What needs to happen to continue the healing process of reconciliation? Because it's painful and it's a difficult conversation to have, and on all sides of the cultural spectrum. What needs to happen in order to make things better?
All right, so I'm fascinated by the idea of a contagion of colonization, because it's interesting that what you have is you have generational change, and it really varies depending on the era that you're in and where the residential schools were. But I'm going to use my own family as an example because fewer people can get angry with me. That you talk about that contagion of colonization. So my great-grandparents on my father's side, when they went to residential school, their first language was Plains Cree. They had probably a smattering of English, but so they would have been actually forced to speak English in the residential school.
Right.
Their Indigenous language would be forbidden. By the time my grandparents came around, they were fluent speakers of the language, but they also spoke English quite well their whole lives. And so they went to residential school, and I'm not certain of this, but I suspect because they presented as more Euro-Canadian, because they were practicing Roman Catholics in my family's case, and because they spoke the settler language, then I suspect that they did have a better time than children who came from a more traditional family background. And then what happens is that we've got my grandparents who went to residential schools in the 30s and 40s. They came out of that and they said, well, we want our kids to have a positive experience in the schools. So they only taught especially their older children, they only taught their older children English. And so the children only got like a kind of a smattering of Cree, and then their older kids went into the residential school system. It still wasn't a positive experience, but I suspect it would have been better. And we look at the same with religion, if you came from a very traditional spiritual background, the residential schools forcible conversion to Christianity would have been very, very harsh. But then we also need to look at people, my grandparents' generation, who went in there as they thought practicing and observant Catholics, but their experience of the residential school was so negative that it alienated them from their natal faith by that time. Right. And so you have the contagion of colonization, that basically you had generations who were taught that the way to be safe and successful in the world was to imitate these sort of imposed middle-class Anglo-Canadian values. And in some ways, I feel like the product of that, because I didn't go to residential school. I actually went to a boarding school, uniforms and tennis and musical theater. And so that you can actually see within my own family's trajectory how even though my great-great-grandparents probably never dreamed or wanted their descendants to become middle-class Anglo-Canadians, that's actually one of the weird artifacts of the residential school. And it even, applied to my great-uncle David Steele Greyeyes fought against Indigenous rights when he worked for Indian Affairs, because he had identified so much with that bureaucratic structure. So what needs to happen with the healing process is that we need to acknowledge the value of Indigenous cultures and Indigenous communities wherever we find them. Because one of the problems is we have this sort of colonial European desire for authenticity. And so we see Métis communities and we say, oh, well, no, you're just kind of like French Canadians. You're not really authentically Métis. When in fact they very are authentically Métis. My children, who are privileged kids who wear suits and take ballet lessons and speak excellent French, they really are First Nations people. But also we need to realize that that's not the only formula for success in the world. That if you're home in your traditional territory, whether it's on a First Nation or not, and you're practicing ceremony, you're practicing your family's traditional language, that's actually a great form of success, and it's actually a form of anti-colonialism. And I think that what we need to do as Canadians, while settler Canadians are doing the work on the calls to action and this sort of thing, Indigenous Canadians and other Canadians need to realize that we need to engage positively, because one of the problems is lateral violence, that you're not, or worse than that, like the settler tourism racism of, oh, you're not Indigenous enough, or you're too successful, you can't be Indigenous. So we need to appreciate those families and communities who are really doing the work on the language and their traditional values.
Mm-hmm.
And we also need to, the leader of the opposition in Manitoba is a First Nations guy, and he's, wears a suit every day and wields great political power. He's also Indigenous. And so I think that, yes, settler Canadians need to do a lot of work, but there also needs to be that positive dialogue, sort of acknowledging people where they're at. I'm not sure if I answered your...
Yeah.
We might have veered into my opinion a bit rather than my workplace, but I'm going to stick with that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, I appreciate that. I don't have any other questions, but I really do appreciate the time. So thank you.
Thank you, John. And I'm just going to end with a little advertising plug.
Yeah.
I would really invite any class at your college, any student group, if you're interested in reconciliation, the calls to action, or the legacy of residential schools, please get in touch with us at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. If you Google those words, we're the first hit. You send a general email, it'll bounce probably to my desk for my supervisors, and we can set up a virtual meeting with your whatever organization you have, or I'll try and convince management to let me fly to Toronto because I love it. So anyway, with that, I will let you go.
That would be great. Thank you.